Back in the 1800s, the only source of communication was to use the Pony Express, which sent messages to people in many different places and took a very long time to do. So one day an invention was created by a man named Samuel Morse, who invented the system of the Morse code. The Morse code was their easiest, fastest way to communicate. The Morse code was actually the reason why 800 people were saved from the Titanic in 1912. One day, someone had an even better invention called the telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell. This was an even better invention than the Morse code. Telephones back then didn't have any buttons on them, so the operator would automatically be dialed. They would dial the number for you. Now we have the newest invention of a telephone called a cell phone, which there are many types of. Radio waves are used to help broadcast the news on radio and music stations, which are used for entertainment. AM means amplitude modulation and FM means frequency modulation. AM frequency goes around the world, whereas FM goes in a straight line. 20 Hz has a low pitch sound and 20,000 Hz is the highest pitch. The early radio. Back then, radios were used for broadcasting advertisement like today. They didn't have TV back then, so they broadcasted their shows over the radio. People who owned their own radio stations would try to overpower the other radio stations, so people would hear their broadcasts instead of other people's. There became a lot of different radio stations that were used for entertainment, including sports, news, shows, educational, religious groups, music, etc. Now we have CD players that play discs in our homes and even in our cars. iPods and MP3 players are used to store selections of music we chose.
Even after the Depression, the popularity of radio continued to soar through the 1930s. During this period, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt used radio to help maintain the confidence of a worried United States. Roosevelt had Congress pass the Communications Act of 1934, which set up the radio's governing body, the FCC. The responsibility of the FCC is to issue and suspend broadcast licenses, regulate station frequencies, and station power and hours of operation. The FCC also issues fines for broadcast content that is objectionable. Broadcasters such as Howard Stern and George Carlin have received such fines. The FCC still exists today, but over the span of the last 2 decades, its power has diminished greatly. Orson Welles was a genius of radio, stage, and film. He was involved in a weekly network radio show. For Halloween night in 1938, Welles had come up with a radio drama that was centered around an invasion from Mars. As soon as they went on air that night, they clearly stated that it was only a dramatic spoof and that the contents were entirely fictional. Most people understood this, but some who had tuned in later on during the broadcast thought it was real and took immediate action. People tuned in on the invasion barricaded themselves in their homes with guns, drove far away to flee areas supposedly getting attacked, and rushed to church to settle things with God. The FCC had a major problem with evangelists expressing their one-sided religious beliefs. A lot of evangelists had their broadcasting licenses revoked because they had attacked certain minority groups without giving them opportunities to defend themselves. Reverend Dr. Schuller, Reverend Charles Coughlin, and Reverend McIntyre all were kicked off the air for committing racial attacks. Reverend McIntyre started an unlicensed radio station off the coast of New Jersey on his private boat, but was eventually shut down by the FCC. The golden age of radio peak of popularity was between the 1930s to the 1940s during the Great Depression. Radio had a wide range of music, comedy, variety shows, and dramatic programming served as a welcome escape from the troubled times. Many people couldn't afford payments to their washing machines, vacuum cleaners, or Model A Fords, but they desperately struggled to keep up payments on their radios. Things were relatively expensive in the 1930s, but a large percentage of people were out of work. The radios themselves were large wooden cases that amounted to elaborate pieces of furniture. Two major players in radio were William Paley and NBC president David Sarnoff, who would later become a corporate legend. Paley's father, Sam, owned a cigar company, and William thought that by purchasing the CBS radio network, they could sell more cigars. The CBS radio network, which had just started, was having a hard time competing with NBC. NBC ran into its own problems and split into two parts, NBC Red and NBC Blue. During World War II, the radio was still very popular. Edward Murrow was a broadcaster of World War II events, and he made you feel as if you had witnessed the events that were taking place in real time. In the following years, radio had been outshined by TV. Instead of listening to the radio together, families turned on the TV to watch their favorite programs together.
Armstrong, an inventor in the mid-1930s, had devised a successful circuit unit more improved than AM radio.
Armstrong improved AM radio and created FM radio.
Armstrong took his invention to a friend, David Sarnoff, head of RCA.
Sarnoff said he would help him develop it.
Sarnoff and RCA wanted to protect AM radio and resulted in costly legal battles that RCA could afford and Armstrong couldn't.
Armstrong developed the FM radio by himself and sold rights to manufacture FM stations to several companies.
50 FM stations were on the air by 1941. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and froze development.
Sanford and RCA pursued the FCC to change all of the FM radio's frequencies.
Listeners were upset that the radio was taken away.
Armstrong gave up his battle on January 31st, 1954. He wrote a note to his wife apologizing and removed his air conditioner from his 13th-story window of his New York apartment and fell to his death.
FM radio started to make money and RCA started pushing its development and made millions. Armstrong never got to see his invention with such great success.
Music producers divide days into day parts and program according to listeners' interests and activities. In the mornings and afternoons during drive time, news, weather, and traffic reports are emphasized, generally with chatty DJs. Rock music quickly became the focus of much of the late afternoon and early evening radio programming. AM stations started moving away from music and moved toward all talk and all news. When iPods arrived on the scene, the popularity of radio took another hit.
The question then became how to make your station, regardless of its format, stand out from the rest. There are more radio stations in the United States specializing in country music than any other format. Most major radio markets have local talk shows. Almost all these are conservative, highly opinionated, and popular, primarily with white male audiences. Today, more than 5,000 traditional radio stations also broadcast their signals over the internet. A new digital service was launched in the United States that doesn't suffer from some of the reception problems of terrestrial AM and FM radio stations.